to abide in you, your word to abide in us, that we might bear abundant fruit that remains to the glory of your name. Lord, we do love you as our great treasure, the pearl of great price. Even in our hearts again, we sell all that we might have you. And it's in your name we pray. Amen. Please be seated. We have been privileged with this conference to have a number of faithful partners and sponsors with us in this venture. One such partner we're about to hear from now is Southeastern Baptist Theological Seminary. And so they've got a couple of representatives who are going to come share with us tonight. Y'all welcome them up to share.
So I came to faith at about 23 years old, and I'm from Mississippi. And I did not grow up in church, but I attended a traditional black church long enough to not feel entirely comfortable behind this pulpit. So I'm just going to stand to the side. So my name is Sherelle Ducksworth, and I am a PhD student at Southeastern Seminary. I am getting my PhD in systematic theology, and so I am going to share with you just some information about Southeastern. I'm here with my husband, who also is a THM student at Southeastern, as well as an admissions counselor. So Southeastern is located in Wake Forest, North Carolina, and they are a Southern Baptist school with a Great Commission focus. Southeastern has a lot of different degree programs that ranges from certificates. You can get your undergraduate degree, graduate degrees, as well as advanced degrees. We also have a multitude of concentrations. So we have church planting, church revitalization, preaching, biblical counseling, theology. So there are a lot of different options if you're interested in seminary education. Now that's pretty similar. Most seminaries offer degrees such as church planting and biblical counseling. But one thing that's unique about Southeastern is their emphasis on diversity and inclusion. And so we have a program called the Kingdom Diversity Initiative. And I'm going to read to you 2 goals of Kingdom Diversity. The first goal is we strive to foster a campus environment that encourages God-honoring interaction across cultural lines. And also, they conduct faculty development and curriculum reform to assist students to minister to people who do not share the same ethnic and cultural background. So from the Kingdom Diversity, we have branches of leadership such as East Asian leadership, we have Persian leadership, Hispanic leadership. But not only does Kingdom Diversity target ethnic minorities, they also target women. So we have an array of degree programs for women. We have a Master of Divinity in Ministry to Women, as well as a Master of Theology in Women's Studies and a Doctor of Ministry in Ministry to Women. We also have a Biblical Women's Institute for women who aren't necessarily seeking degrees, but just want to get some theological education. And we have what is called the Society for Scholarship. So women are actively being trained to further their academic abilities and also writing to help us to prepare to enter into scholarship. So that's a little bit of the formal information about Southeastern, and I want to share with you some personal reasons why I chose to go to Southeastern. So I've been to a previous seminary, and I knew that God called me to do PhD studies, but a lot of seminaries don't allow women to do PhD studies. Specifically, they don't allow women to do PhD studies in theology. So that's one reason why I chose Southeastern, because I wanted to go to a place where I wasn't just tolerated, but I was celebrated. Southeastern does that. Also, I wanted to go to a place where my research interest would be treated with similar enthusiasm as other research interests. So my desire is to study Black liberation theology, womanist theology, feminist theology, and the social gospel. Now, when I say that, I sound liberal. Most of the time when I say that, people perceive me as being unorthodox or liberal. And Southeastern doesn't do that. So they give me the ability to contextualize my research interest because I see a need. They also approach these different theologies with dignity and value. And so that's the reason why I chose to go to an institution that would allow me to contextualize my research for my specific ministry so that I can engage culture from a biblically based position. So my husband and I will be downstairs at our Southeastern table. So if you want any more information, please stop by. Thank you.
Don't everybody leave and go enroll at Southeastern at once. We have the privilege tonight of sort of shifting sort of themes just a little bit. So this morning in our first two addresses, we were thinking about our pilgrim identity. This evening in our next two addresses, we're going to be thinking, beginning to sort of shift to think about politics, to think about public theology, political theology, to think about the doctrine of the church and its place in public theology and political theology. And we have two brothers who are just really well educated, well studied, well trained, committed to these areas of focus with an eye toward helping the church. And the first brother to speak to us tonight is actually an Abraham Kuyper scholar. He's also a professor at Wheaton University up in Wheaton, Illinois. He's authored a number of books, some of them too scholarly for me to read, and some of them I'm hanging on to. And some quite accessible, like his book, Political Disciple. He has written about these things, thought about these things over the years, and is a gift to the church. And it's with great joy that I introduce to you our brother Vincent Bacote. Come, brother, and open up the word for us.
It's great to be here. Before I start, I want to say two things. One, amazing band, amazing music, right? And as an average bass guitarist, thank you for putting the bass in the mix rather than under the mix or invisible in the mix. Talk to bass players sometimes, they'll tell you what I'm talking about. The second thing I want to note is, so our sister from Southeastern, she talked about what her scholarly interests are, and sometimes when people hear those things, liberation theology, womanist theology, etc., people start getting kind of, wow, that's interesting that that's what you care about. And to what I want to say is, whatever you think about it, the question you need to ask yourself is, why is there a womanist theology? Why is there a liberation theology? Because of things that didn't happen in other places, or things that did that created problems that people felt like they had to answer, and then you got womanist theology, you got liberation theology, you got black theology. So it's really important to think about that. Why do you have that? Now, that's not my lecture. That's what I'm talking about tonight. But I wanted to say that because sometimes people go, oh, I think I know what it's about. Well, maybe you don't. Maybe you don't, because you need to ask, why is that what they're doing? And if they're not in my church, if they're not thinking about things the way I'm thinking about it, why is that the case? What didn't happen that led to them creating what they've created? So that's an important thing for us to think about. But that's not my topic. My topic is about can we be Christians and be involved in politics? So what I'd like to do is begin by asking this simple question, which may seem obvious, but I'm going to ask it anyway, and that is the question, well, what is a Christian to begin with? And there are actually several ways that you could answer that question. So here are some of the ways you could answer that question. Consider these. You could say a Christian is a believer in Jesus. A Christian is a child of God. A Christian is a member of the church. A Christian is a member of God's household. A Christian is a holy person, as in a person who belongs to God, who is set apart to God. A Christian is a citizen of God's kingdom. A Christian is a human who has been made alive by the Holy Spirit, someone who's born again. A Christian is a disciple. And certainly we can say a Christian is a sojourner or a pilgrim. And that's not all the things that one could say that a Christian is, but those are some of the things that one could say when I ask the question, what is a Christian? And I'd like to invite you to think about this for just a second, and that is this. If someone asks you, what is a Christian, what's the first thing you say? What's the first thing that you say? And I think that's important because the way you answer that question has a great influence on the way you're going to think about the relationship between your identity as a Christian and how that identity relates to however you conceive of politics or the political. And the way you answer that some of the time can draw you further away from politics or create greater tension with politics. Other ways of answering it might actually make you much closer to politics. So it's very important for us to think about that relationship between our identity as Christians and how we think about politics. So what do I mean when we're talking about politics? So here is my, what they call 30,000-foot answer for what politics is. Politics is how we manage our common life together. How we manage our common life together. So what I mean is, in other words, it's how we as human beings figure out things that are basically like outside of our personal life or outside of our household. Here's a very simple example. Once upon a time, there were roads, but those roads were only dirt roads. Then along comes the technologies that can make improvements in roads. And somebody says, we'd like to have those improvements in our roads. Well, who decides when you're going to make that improvement? Who decides who's going to plan it? Who decides how it's going to get paid for? Who's going to navigate all of that? Political life is really doing a lot of very unsexy things like that. Yes, politics certainly has to do with things like should you decriminalize or make legal marijuana like you have in Illinois? Or how you're thinking about questions like should the government either place restrictions on or do you hope that it eliminates something like abortion? Or questions like how do we navigate in our justice system issues with the death penalty? So you have those kinds of things. Or how large of a military should we have? We do all those kinds of things. But most of politics you don't hear about on television. And most of politics is incredibly unsexy and procedural. That's most of what political life is, in this management of everything that goes on outside of the household, so to speak. So we shouldn't think about politics primarily as in just the things that are controversial and connected with whatever we think politics is about, or thinking that about ways that politics has gone wrong. I think it's very important when you think about politics to not ask the question, what has gone wrong, or what's terrible, or what's corrupt about politics, but what is it, and what's its purpose? That's a better question to ask first than thinking about all the ways that it has gone wrong. Because you can always find with anything the ways that it's gone wrong. But what would it be at its best if we're thinking about how we're managing our common life together? That's what we need to be thinking about when we're thinking about what politics is. what we do together with our common life. I want to propose another way also to think about politics. And it's a certain opportunity that exists, at least in some countries, with politics. And that's this. It is a way to love your neighbor by the way that you participate in your political system. At the very least, how you vote from the local to the national level, and how you do things like write to the people in the various political positions, whether you show up at town halls or at the school board, all those types of things. Those are opportunities for you to not only think about your interests, but you're thinking about the interests of everybody else. You're thinking about a pursuit of what some of us call the common good, the good of all people. And politics is one of the ways to pursue the good of all people, a way of loving your neighbor. It's not generally the way that people probably think about politics, but that is one of the great opportunities that one can have with politics. Well, can a Christian be political? Now, Thabiti told you that my dissertation figure was Abraham Kuyper. And yes, his picture's in my office, I'll admit it. But he's also how I became a critical thinker, because he was a less than perfect figure. Read the disclaimer in the first chapter of My Political Disciple, and you know what I'm talking about. But, so that'll tell you, because Abraham Kuyper was the Prime Minister of the Netherlands, that'll probably tell you that, of course, my answer is yes. But why is it yes? There are a lot of reasons I could give you, but I'm going to focus on two briefly. Number one is this. The cultural mandate, or what some call the creation mandate, remains as our first great commission. So page 1 of the Bible, Genesis 1:26, God creates humans, and what does he say is going to be the purpose, the function of humans? They're going to be the ones who are the rulers of creation. And this gets echoed in Psalm 8. Part of what's going on in Psalm 8 is this amazement, this wonder at saying, God, you've given us this privilege, this opportunity to be the ones who rule over your creation. Yes, he does. And it's not just about agriculture. It's about everything that's involved with ruling or managing well the world that God has made. That is the responsibility that he has given to human beings. And I call it the first Great Commission because managing God's entire creation sounds like a pretty big commission to me. So I call it the first Great Commission. I'm not the only one. It's not original to me, but I call it the first Great Commission. And that commission remains. Genesis 3, because somebody might say, great that you're on page 1 and that you're kind of echoing it in Psalm 8, but don't forget about page 3. I'm not forgetting about page 3. I know what happens at page 3. It gets really bad. The horror show starts. That's what happens in Genesis 3. But I want you to be aware of the fact that Genesis 3 does not make the commission go away. It brings massive complication into the practice of that commission. God never says, okay, here comes the curse, so you're supposed to have childbirth. No, I don't think so. You're supposed to have fruitfulness from the ground. I don't think so. No, he says you still get childbirth, but it's going to be rough. And you're still going to get fruit from the ground, but you're not going to only get fruit from the ground. You're now going to get complications in the way that you work with the ground. And likewise, all the things that we do post-Genesis 3 are now complicated by the fact that sin has entered the world. So we have a complicated first Great Commission, but often it's a forgotten or undiscovered Great Commission for many Christians. So if it's undiscovered for you, I invite you to rediscover it. So the cultural mandate, the first Great Commission, remains for us. And I should also say, I'm one of those people who would argue that even with no fall, if that had happened, we would still have political life. It would be better political life. It would be non-controversial political life, but we would still have it because we'd still be doing things that are managing our lives outside the household together, and we would need to find ways to cooperate with those things outside of our households. So that remains regardless. Now that we have the fall, we have other things that we have to do with politics in addition to what we would have had if there were no fall. So I think that politics would always be there. But post-fall, we have the complicated politics. So that's the first reason. The second reason, I'll be more brief about this, is Christians should be political because we are subjects of a king. Jesus is a king. Now, however you think about the relationship of that kingdom and when it's going to come, whatever your eschatology is, we can work all that out later today if you want to do that. But however you're thinking about that, the point is that Jesus is a king. And if you are a subject of the king, then you have a political identity. You cannot escape that identity and say, oh, just give me Jesus and let me escape politics. No, because just give you Jesus means just give me at least his politics. At the very least. Because he's a king. And you're his subject. Now, how you live as that subject and how you live as that subject in our world of politics, it's going to depend upon a major consideration we have to think about. And that is this. Where are you living as a Christian? Here's what I mean. If the where you live is, say, North Korea, no matter what I just said about the First Great Commission or about living as a kingdom citizen, your political expression is going to be rather local, rather inside your household, maybe with your circle of friends. But you have about this much influence in shaping the direction of society because it's a totalitarian society. If you live in Malaysia, as a Christian, you're not going to have a lot of influence because it's a Muslim country. And it's a Muslim country where they're enforcing it being a Muslim country. If you're in Saudi Arabia, they're our ally, but they're also a police state. They're also a kingdom. So whatever you think about politics, your politics is only going to be local in those situations. But if you live in these United States, then you are in a republic. And if you are in this republic, you are a citizen in this republic. And if you are a citizen in this republic, you have opportunities as a citizen to do things about the direction of this country. At least on paper, any boy and girl can grow up one day and you too can be president of the United States. Now, that's the theory. We can talk about the real, but the point is, hardly anybody's going to be president, but a lot of people, one, can vote, and two, a lot of people can do things that influence the people that get elected to office. And some people, if they choose to do this because they want to actually be involved in public service, they can run for office. That's something you can do if you're in this republic. And if you're a Christian, then in this republic, you have considerable opportunity for who you are as a Christian to inform what you do in public engagement, in political practice. It's right there, an opportunity for us in these United States. Here's something I want you to think about, though. I said how we as Christians can inform what we do in terms of our political life and in terms of our political commitments. Here's a question I want you to think about your congregations, whether you're a church leader or whether you're just a member of your church. How do the people in your church relate or connect what they believe as Christians to their political commitments? If what they believe is over here and their political commitments are over here, can you draw a line between what they believe and what their political commitments are? Here's my wager. Most people can't. And the reason most people can't is because they arrive at their political commitments this way. Something does this. It knocks on their door. Oh, what is it that knocks on their door? Some kind of thing that's called a political concern of a sort. And it shows up on your doorstep, and then it becomes your political concern. Or something becomes your political concern because someone whose authority you admire, someone you appreciate, someone you trust, tells you you should care about it. So you do. The question is, are the things that you believe as Christians leading you to actually have political commitments? Or do you already have political commitments and then you try to have a kind of ad hoc relationship between those political commitments and something you believe as a Christian? In which case, you've got some political concerns and you got something that you believe and you kind of figure out some kind of relationship. Have you ever wondered why sometimes some of you have had these interesting situations where perhaps you grew up Republican and you're involved in some kind of Christian fellowship, and you got a friend in this Christian fellowship who grew up Democrat, and everybody's enjoying the fellowship together until politics comes up, and both of you all of a sudden discover that, wait a minute, wait. You thought Christians are supposed to vote what? Vote how? Whoa, what's going on? It happens all the time. And what would be interesting in those situations would be if people ask, why is this my political commitment? Why do I think this is the way, of course, a Christian can vote? You know, one of the funniest things I thought back in 2008 is when President Obama was running, there are some people who said, oh, there's no way any Christian would ever vote Democrat. And I thought, do you know my relatives? Because you know who they're not going to vote for? You know how they've never voted? Maybe they voted for Reagan over Mondale, but except for that, you know how they voted? They've consistently voted Democrat. And last time I checked, they seem pretty Christian to me. So how can you say no Christian would ever vote Democrat? And of course, the thing you also need to wonder is, you know, there's some other conversations some people have where they say, you know what I can't understand? I can't understand why any Christian would ever be a Republican. That conversation happens, too. And my point is this. Why are some people Republicans? Why are some people Democrats? What leads them to have those political commitments? And I would wager to you that for most of them, it's because of what showed up on their doorstep, what became an interest for them, therefore a priority for them, rather than here I am as a Christian, and what emerges out of what I am as a Christian, it's created a kind of radar for me, and I'm looking for all these ways where people are not being loved as neighbors, where they're being antagonized as neighbors, and therefore I see a political interest over there. That's not usually what happens. What usually happens is, oh, there's some crisis, and it's kind of related to who I am, or somebody told me I should care about it, so I care about it. What if what you believed as a Christian opened up the way for you to have political priorities and political commitments, rather than saying, here's political commitments, let me figure out how my faith kind of hooks onto it. And then when it hooks onto it, it kind of rubber stamps it. It kind of prioritizes it. And then other things you don't prioritize somehow don't matter as much. But there are other Christians, there are other things that have come across their doorstep, and their faith hooks onto that, and they prioritize that. And then some things that you care about don't matter as much to them. That's why, friends, you need to understand. If you don't understand why a lot of African Americans don't think a lot about the abortion issue, right? It's because they're thinking about just trying to survive the lives that they have. And if that's what they're thinking about, you know the people that at least have given lip service to those life concerns. It's been more the people in the blue than the people in the red. And so they say, so I'm going to kind of vote there. And people go, but what about the babies, you say? They say, what about the people once they've grown up? That's what they say. And they decide to go that way, to go blue rather than to go red. But what if we think about how what we believe informs how we think about our politics? Let me talk about 3 examples of how our Christian identity can play a role in relationship to our politics. So first, there's a lot of things I could go with. I just went with these 3. So 1, a Christian is a citizen of God's kingdom, as I said earlier. If a Christian is a citizen of God's kingdom, then that means that Jesus is their king. Now, if Jesus is their king, I think what they would tell you is that means that they have their ultimate allegiance to Jesus as their king, which makes all other obligations relative. All other commitments relative. And so, the question we have to ask is, if Jesus is your king, if he's your number 1, right, the one you're like, you're first, trust me. The question is, how does that allegiance relate to your political commitments? What's the relationship between those things? Here's something that we need to regularly ask ourselves. And notice that I said we, not just you, okay? So I'm saying us. We need to regularly ask ourselves, if there are certain political commitments that I call my non-negotiable political commitments, right? Here's the thing we should ask ourselves. If I have quote-unquote non-negotiable political commitments, am I willing to even have those quote-unquote non-negotiable political commitments questioned by this king to whom I have an ultimate allegiance? Can he ask me, hey, can we revisit that? Can we talk about that? Can we see if there's more going on there than you think is going on over there? Can I ask you about that? And of course, the thing is, if your answer is, well, I'm just pretty sure, where I've arrived is exactly where God would want me to arrive. I think the question has to be, why are you unwilling to have that questioned? Why are you unwilling to say, hey, Jesus, you're my king. So since you're my king, yes, you can put this to the test routinely. If your answer is no, I can't, then I submit to you that maybe Jesus isn't quite the king you say he is. Because you have a clear kind of commitment to whatever is going on with this non-negotiable. And maybe you're unaware of the fact that the non-negotiable is missing something. And you're not interested in finding out if it's missing something. But if Jesus is your king, he's your king and my king, we need to let him interrogate us all the time. Right? And so here's a little test I invite you to do. Go to your congregation and say, all right, I want everyone to write down their most prominent political commitment. And then say, all right, so here's what we're going to do. We're going to do a little exercise, and we'll do it when nobody has to see what you write down. Can Jesus ask you about that commitment? And if he asks you about it, is it possible something might change about that commitment? What do you think would happen? And by the way, I'm talking about all kinds of congregations, not just certain congregations. Because equal opportunity. All right? So if we as Christians believe that Jesus is a king, the fact that he's king ought to lead us to be people who are saying, I've got to be continually making sure that it's clear to everyone that my allegiance is to Jesus first and everything else is relative. And the thing is, everything else is so relative that you're even willing to say about things that maybe you've been, allied with for a long time. You can say, you know what? There has come a point of dissonance, a level of dissonance between my fidelity to my king and this thing. And if I'm going to maintain my fidelity to the king, I got to step aside. That's what it means for Jesus to be a king for us. A second example. A Christian is a holy person, which means a Christian is a sanctified person in terms of their position, but they are also a person that is in a process of sanctification. You're on the way to becoming more and more like a person that belongs to God. You're changing. You're hopefully becoming more holy. Now, here's the thing. If you're in a process of sanctification, it means you what? Have not arrived. If you have not arrived, it probably includes the fact that part of the way you have not arrived is that you don't actually see everything in the world with perfect clarity. It might mean then that actually, if I'm on the way somewhere, that part of my transformation process includes acknowledging that in some places my vision is kind of blurry. And that maybe there's a blind spot. Here's an interesting fact about Vincent Bacote, okay? I have no relatives with glaucoma. Somehow, like at age 31, I was diagnosed with glaucoma. It's under control, thank God, et cetera. I take drops every day, et cetera. But here's one of the things I learned. I have to do this thing called a visual field test. It takes less time now than it used to. You sit with a clicker and look at dots with one eye covered. So you do left eye, do with the right eye. Here's what I learned from the visual field test. In my left eye, right here, this quadrant is a blind spot. If I didn't do this visual field test, I would never know that I had a blind spot. Now, because of where it is, my right eye compensates for the fact that I have a blind spot. But if this eye is covered up, the way it would work is things that are over here, I would miss. But the only way I know now that I know that there are things that I would miss is because I know from the visual field test that I've got blind spots. Now, here's the thing. If you really believe that you're in a process of sanctification, that's like your sort of visual field test for your perception. And the fact that you're in that process is telling you, hey, because you haven't yet arrived, you know that you've got blind spots. You miss things. You don't see everything with crystal clarity. And the point is this, okay? This has to be, I think, true of the way most of us in this room think about the process of sanctification. Why am I saying that? Because this is a crowd that skews to more a reformed trajectory. If I was in a room full of Wesleyan holiness people, it'd be a very different state of affairs. Because some of you might say, no. I have had a post-conversion cleansing action within myself that has made me perfect in love for God, and therefore I'm good. I'm entirely sanctified. But this isn't a crowd, I don't think, where anyone's saying, yes, I am entirely sanctified. I am holy. I haven't sinned in years. right? I don't think this is that crowd. This is the crowd that you talk about like depravity, right? So the point is this. If you're not Wesleyan, then and you're recognizing you're being transformed from the depths of depravity, you understand that, of course, you're not fully out of the depths of depravity. There's some ways that it kind of holds on, some ways it kind of shows up. Maybe it shows up in your political perception. And the thing is, then, that means when it comes to your politics, you recognize, I might be missing something. I might have blurry vision. I might have blind spots. It may be a little less blurry, but still blurry. I don't see it completely clearly. Which means then that whatever you're doing with your political commitments, you need to have a posture of humility because you have not arrived. And if you have a posture of humility, even the things about which you have a relative level of confidence about that political position, about that issue, about why you ought to prioritize this issue over another, you recognize, yeah, I feel kind of strongly about that, but let's make sure I put an asterisk beside that, or I hang a subject to revision sign on it, because I don't see completely clearly. If a Christian is someone who is in a process of becoming holy in position, but in a process of living up to what that position is, then we ought to be people of humility when it comes to how we are articulating and pursuing our political commitments. A third example, a Christian is a believer in the resurrected Jesus, and thus a Christian is a person of the greatest hope of all. Now the thing is, if you are a believer in the resurrected Jesus, we're on the way to Easter, and those of you who are church calendar types, you're counting down the days. If you are a believer in this resurrected Jesus, then that means that when it comes to politics, you should not be someone who is a peddler of fear. Now, if you want to raise money, I understand, okay? You're like, what do? Scare them. Because when they scare them, all of a sudden they go, okay, what do you want? Because I'm terrified, and I know that if I give you money, you'll make it go away. It's not what usually happens, but, it's an effective device. The point is, if you're a Christian, you should not be the people who are acting as if when it comes to political concerns or political fortunes not going a particular way, you don't act like, I'm not sure that God can actually handle the political circumstances of this place. In which case, I think you've got a case of what I like to call Easter amnesia. Easter amnesia is you went to Easter, you supposedly have been singing and hearing sermons about the fact that he got up, which means that God conquered death. And if that's what you believe, strangely then, you're on Twitter or something, you're talking about, no, don't you understand? We're going to lose it all if we don't do this. I'm like, wait, did you just go to church? Did you just hear that God conquered death? Because if you believe he conquered death, why are you acting like, but he can't deal with this? If you don't have Easter amnesia, which I hope you don't, or if you do, I hope you get the prescription soon to address it. The days are coming, you'll get it. If you don't have Easter amnesia, then here's the thing. The point isn't that because you're not a peddler of fear, you become an expert in being delusional and being a liar about the fact that the world is disappointing. No, actually, you say, hey, you know what? I can tell, even with my blurry vision, that things are kind of not going so great politically right now. There seem to be trajectories that give me concern right now. They make me nervous right now. I'm not sure how this is going to turn out right now. You can admit that without being a peddler of fear and suggesting that these topsy-turvy dimensions of politics are somehow too difficult for God. No Christian should ever say that if they really believe that Jesus has been raised from the dead. Because if God can conquer death, I think he can handle the peaks and valleys of what happens in these United States. But I fear a lot of Christians, and not just because somebody's raising money, they act as if God is somehow unable to navigate what's going on here. And you know what one of the funniest things about all that is? Sometimes they talk about our republic like our republic is the new Israel. Let me give you all a news flash. And yes, this is on the camera. I'm so glad. If it's a live stream, great. Or for the recording, let me just say this loud and clear, okay? The Bible says about this much about these United States in the Bible. Unless you're talking about to the ends of the earth. Unless you're talking about all the nations, not just this nation. The point is that this is, I'm fine talking about certain ways America's exceptional or whatever, but exceptional doesn't mean New Israel. Exceptional doesn't mean the centerpiece of God's plan for history. It's a place where, yes, it's a place where you can actually, relative to some other places in the world, you have more opportunity for religious expression with different denominations, etc. That's a fantastic thing about the American experiment. None of that means, hey, George Washington, your name's really Moses. Okay? That's called, I think that's pretty heretical, frankly. The point is, God doesn't need this country to carry out his purposes. He can use this country as part of carrying out his purposes, but this country is not the center of his narrative. I mean, good luck finding it in those Bibles. Those Bibles say a lot about another hemisphere and not so much about this one. So if we're going to be people of hope, whether our country is in the Bible or not, it's not, then we should be people who are agents of hope no matter the circumstance. If you want to be countercultural, live like a person of hope no matter what happens in the general election in November. I mean, express your disappointment, express your concern, but say, here's the thing about whatever happens with these political circumstances. They do not surprise God. They are not too much for God to handle. We ought to be people of hope, witnesses to the greatest hope of all. So I'm about to wrap up, and I want to actually mention a fourth aspect of our Christian identity. And that is, we're talking about pilgrim politics as our theme here. And it's true, there's that language in Peter that says that we are pilgrims or sojourners or aliens or exiles, depends upon your translation. And so we are people who do not have a first obligation to whatever nation or political system that we are part of. But here's the way I want us to think about this. We are then a people who are truly distinct, who truly belong to God, who are truly, in view of a land that has not yet fully arrived. But that does not lead us to abandon politics. It means that we engage politics as those distinctive people, as people with particular loyalties, and as people with a fervent commitment to seeking the good of all people. Now that's distinctive, because politics is often about what? About this group's interests, that group's interests, that group's interests. And my point isn't that those interests don't matter. The point is, if I'm a Christian, I need to be concerned about the good of everyone. Which means, for example, if you're a religious freedom person, then ask yourself, do I really mean religious freedom for everybody, or Or do I mean only for certain Christians? I mean, can Hindus have religious freedom? Can Muslims have religious freedom? Can Buddhists have religious freedom? Zoroastrians have religious freedom? Et cetera, et cetera. Can those people have religious freedom? Or is it really just a way you're talking actually about your interests? If you're really seeking the good of all people, are you seeking in a country like the United States, a republic that really creates the opportunities for flourishing for everybody? And you want everybody's flourishing, not just your flourishing or the flourishing of your group or of your people? Is that what you want? If that's what you want, you will be distinctive. That will be characteristic of somebody who can do that doesn't need to hold too tight to their own interests. Why? Because you belong to God's kingdom. And because you belong to God's kingdom, you don't have to hoard political interests here. You can be generous in your political practice, generous in what you hope for, in the political outcomes for others. Imagine if Christians were known for being distinct, not because of being anti-intellectual, not because of being mean, not because of being haters, but known for being distinctive because they really are seeking how to love their neighbors, and politics is one of the ways that they seek to do it. What if that was our byline? What if that was our reputation? Do you think that people would think that the word evangelical somehow, even though good news is in it, it doesn't really mean good news? Or it means particular news? We have an opportunity right now to be incredibly good news people, because people are losing their minds. They've been losing their minds for a while, but they're really losing their minds. People are in distress. They're confused. They're not sure where things are going. Christians ought to be the people that say, I have hope. I belong to God. He's in charge of history. And He tells me in the second greatest commandment to love my neighbor as myself and not to have any exception clauses for neighbor. And that I'm really seeking the good of all my neighbors. And we're really known for vigilantly seeking the good of all people. That can be who we are, especially if we're letting what we believe orient us towards our political commitments and our political practices. What a reputation we can build up. What a reputation we can have if we're willing to be those people. I hope you are willing to be those people. If you don't remember anything else I said, be a Christian that belongs to God, an agent of hope, absolutely committed to the good of all of your neighbors, and you think about how can I make politics part of the way that I do that. If you don't remember anything else I said, remember that. Thank you.